WCNC Charlotte. This is Flashpoint, where power and politics collide and the tough questions get asked and answered.
Thanks for joining us here on Flashpoint. I'm Ben Thompson. We are now just over 3 weeks away from the midterm elections, with early voting starting this Thursday. And a lot is at stake, from the economy to abortion rights, some big issues likely driving folks to the polls. Coming up in a few minutes, we'll hear about how Mecklenburg County is preparing for early voting. But first, we're already getting a sense of how things are shaping up. Joining us now is Catawba College political professor, friend of the show, Michael Bitzer. Dr. Bitzer, thanks as always for coming on. We appreciate it.
My pleasure, as always.
All right, what, if anything, can we glean from the absentee ballots that have been cast so far?
I would be cautious in trying to read too much into the tea leaves, other than there appears to be a sustained and energized momentum, particularly among women voters. Women are making up substantial majorities of these early ballots, both requested and returned so far. We are substantially ahead of 2018's numbers, but we're paling in comparison to 2020, which is not to be unexpected due to COVID during that particular election. But I caution folks to try and not read too much into these numbers, simply because if we looked at only the mail-in votes in 2020, Joe Biden would have won North Carolina 70% to 30%. That didn't happen. Donald Trump ended up winning North Carolina. And I think what this says is there's another healthy amount of absentee-by-mail ballots coming in, but we have early in-person voting starting on October 20th. We, of course, have Election Day. So I think in the grand scheme of things, this seems to indicate some momentum, particularly among Democratic and unaffiliated women, but we'll just have to wait and see how the next couple of weeks play out.
Your point, though, is that oftentimes Democrats over-index when it comes to some of these absentee ballots, traditionally speaking.
Exactly. Both with absentee by mail, which is a relatively new phenomenon for Democrats to be utilizing. Before 2020, it was heavily Republicans who utilized absentee by mail ballot. 2020 shifted that dynamic. Democrats also tend to use early in-person voting those couple of weeks before Election Day. But on Election Day, it tends to be more Republican. And that tends to even things out, giving a slight edge often times to Republicans.
So rare do you see one race, 1 year completely change voter trends and how the different parties operate. It's very, very interesting. Let's talk about trends in voter registration. Anything we can glean from that?
We're still seeing a continued healthy increase with voter registration having ended. We are now into the same day registration period moving forward towards November 8th. But the numbers seem to indicate a comparable amount of people registering for this election as they did in 2018. No real surprises, but the continuation for those of us who study this data is the rise of the unaffiliated voters. Over 50% of people registering now are registering unaffiliated. That is being driven by voters under the age of 40, particularly Gen Z is well in the unaffiliated camp, but it doesn't mean that they're necessarily political independents. They may just simply not like the party labels, but they are indeed partisans when they end up voting in elections.
All right, let's talk about some of the races. Chief among them, the U.S. Senate race. Polls right now show the race dead heat within the margin of error for Budd and Beasley. Where do you see this race as we go into early voting?
It is certainly the sleeper race, I think, of the U.S. Senate races. Maybe Nevada's race is the other sleeper race that folks are starting to pay attention to. But North Carolina has a tradition of basically having the margin of victory being in the margin of error. If you look at all of these polls and take into account the margin of error and the bandwidth that both candidates have, we will ultimately end up somewhere in that bandwidth. Yes, Beasley is having a very good race, all things considered. particularly in what should be a pro-Republican advantage year of a midterm year. But this is going to be down to the wire, I think, unless there is a late break, and that typically moves to the party that is opposite the president's party, and that would benefit Bud and Republicans.
You mentioned it was a sleeper. Why do you think that was? I mean, we talked about this after the Tillis-Cunningham race, that this could be another barn burner and be one of the most expensive races in the country. And at one point, Laura Trump might run for this seat, and Pat McCrory ran for the seat, of course. Jeff Jackson was in the race at one point. And I feel like it's sort of, I don't want to say fizzled out, but not been what some people predicted, thought it might be.
It certainly has not been the barn burner. And if you look just at the money coming into North Carolina, yes, we're starting to get some multi-million-dollar ad buys because of the level of competitiveness. But I think Democrats look at North Carolina and aren't really sure statewide what they can do to make it a Democratic victory. There have been Democrats, Roy Cooper, for example, who have shown the success path to get towards victory on Election Day. But I think for a lot of national strategists, maybe they've just gotten burned too many times. It's been since Kay Hagan won a U.S. Senate seat in 2008. Democrats have not been successful. Maybe they're just looking at North Carolina and saying, we can't quite figure out what to do in that state, and so we'll kind of hold back.
All right, there's also 14 congressional races on the line, including a battle for the 14th district. That's the brand new congressional district created following that new census data. Jeff Jackson, Pat Harrigan, trading jabs. What is, of the congressional races, which one are you looking at most closely?
Yes, the 14th has some interest, but it is much more of a Democratic-leaning district than the 13th congressional district, which is housed in South Raleigh, South Wake County, into Johnston and Wayne and Harnett counties. I think all of the national attention really is on that 13th congressional district, Wiley Nickel, the Democrat, versus Bo Hines, the Trump Republican. I think in the 14th, certainly the expectation is that is, based on past elections, a very likely Democratic seat, about 58% Democratic by my measurements. But if Democrats are not having the night that they need to have, if there are indeed Republican waves going on, that race may be closer than what it could be in terms of the normal dynamics.
And we expect all these districts will change again next year?
Don't get used to this map, and don't get used to these district configurations, because for the umpteenth decade yet again, North Carolina will be redrawing its congressional districts after the first attempt. So yes, get used to these until November 8th. After November 9th, all bets are off.
Get used to them and then don't get used to them. Final question, the Dobbs ruling. You mentioned this earlier when you talked about registration and absentee ballots. The decision to overturn a federal right to abortion. How do you think it's factoring into this race here in North Carolina?
I think it is certainly, like the nation as a whole, it has lit a fire under Democrats, and they needed something to energize them. They needed something to mobilize their base, and they got that with the Dobbs decision. The question is, can that energy and momentum be sustained for the next couple of weeks up to November 8th? We'll just have to wait and see. But, in all other dynamics, this is a Republican advantage year. That one issue has made it the competitiveness that we are seeing in North Carolina and across the country.
All right, Professor of Politics at Catawba College. Dr. Bitzer, thanks as always. We do appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right, more Flashpoint after this.